This is Who's a Good Dev, the podcast where we interview great software developers, brought to you by greptile.com.
Welcome back to the second ever video episode of this show. Welcome to Who's a Good Dev. I'm really excited about today's guest. It's Ted Nyman.
Hey.
Ted is the founder of Cased. And before this, Ted was the CTO of VP Engineering of GitHub.
That's right.
For 4 years.
Yeah, well, I was a systems engineer there first, and then a few years after that in
Very cool.
leadership positions. Yeah.
One of the most important developer tools companies ever. And I'm really excited. We're going to talk about a lot of things. Scaling GitHub, because as you were there in what I would imagine is a rapid scaling period of the company. And also about building developer tools, about running large teams, and also just about how to be a better career engineer. Be a better engineer and have a better engineering career, which are related but different skills, I would think.
Yeah, very different.
Yeah. Great. Well, first of all, also, this is
I'm here now.
This is great. Today I'm joined with Rajat, our co-host. Rajat is a member of technical staff here at Greptile. We're going with MTS for that's like all the cool AI companies where we don't have software engineers here. And yeah, Rajat, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Rajat.
Great.
Very efficient.
Yeah, what else do you need?
Yeah.
Well, so to start off with, Ted, I want to ask you about GitHub. Where was the company when you had started? What 4 years into the journey? What did it look like?
Yeah, so GitHub, very interesting sort of story where the company grew relatively slowly in terms of headcount. When I joined, we were still, about 50 people, let's say. First few years, the company never got more than, a dozen. And that's where, most of the features that people have come to know and love were developed, pull requests, basic issue management, things like that. So we were beginning to grow the engineering team, had quite a few users. So we were just about to kind of go into more of like the sort of hyper growth of the infrastructure stage, and then also a lot more hiring at that point. So I think, at that point we had just, it was before we had raised the Series A, which was, I think at that time was the largest Series A maybe ever at that point. Now the numbers are different, but at that point it was pretty big.
How much was it then?
It's $100 million at that point.
I would say that's still pretty
That's
big.
pretty
Yeah,
massive.
still pretty big.
Yeah, for an A, it's so huge.
It was still big. GitHub was kind of famously had not raised money, right? So it was sort of famously bootstrapped. There was a blog post, I think it was called Bootstrapped and Profitable from early on. And it's funny now, no one would think about it, but at that time it was, you had to kind of balance it over, company wasn't selling out, we were still going to maintain, because that was actually an important part of the early history, was that this was not taking VC. But
Interesting.
Now people wouldn't, you wouldn't think about it.
Yeah.
Just kind of, but at that time there was a little bit of question as to would it remain true to its roots. So, but yeah, once that happened, we were able to do a lot of things, particularly around a lot of that money went to scaling the infrastructure. We'll talk more about this later because it's fun. We ran a very, very
Lean infrastructure.
yeah,
right?
very lean infrastructure.
I saw a tweet about this.
Yeah, I mean, really like crazy how lean we were, and some of that was because we were interested in cost savings. A part of it was just like the logistics of we weren't in a cloud infrastructure at that time. We were literally we were using rack space at the time, and we were literally trying to find computers that we could put into the racks. So some of the scaling challenges,
It's like pre-AWS and stuff.
yeah, I mean,
Well,
AWS was
wasn't
around, but
involved,
we weren't in there at the time. So a lot of our early scaling challenges were literally physically, can we get enough machines? and things
Yeah,
like that.
that's crazy. For getting enough racks with servers in.
Yeah.
Like scaling is it's still hard today, but had the additional challenge of like all these other things that you had to deal with, which now hyperscalers deal with for you.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, we
Yeah.
still, and I think, a lot of people who worked then would tell you that they learned a lot more about infrastructure than they would like to know,
Yeah.
Which, I think, but again, we were running, what we thought of as like a utility product, right? Like this is a product that I would always be on. So there's certain value in knowing that infrastructure. And we did, we had a fairly large infra team given how many engineers we had total, and probably much larger than you'd have, today if you're just sort of, outsourcing all your stuff to a cloud provider or something like that.
Gotcha. So you talked So we've been hanging out at the office for a little while now. So we talked a little bit about, there were multiple eras of GitHub. So you said 2008 to 2011, 8 or 9 people. That was kind of the first era. So, that was when PRs, issues, that was around that time.
Yeah.
And then, so you joined kind of right before the Series A?
Yeah, right before the Series A.
All right, so 2011?
Yeah, early 2012.
2012. And there was a Series A. And so what was that second era of GitHub? I mean, we talked a little bit about it. But.
Yeah, I think, so, GitHub's a really interesting story in that it was one of these companies that had almost instant product market fit, right? Where everything you could possibly want, and this is atypical, right? Like most companies don't have this. It's nice if you have it. I think, certainly like at Case, we're a new startup. And I think like every other startup, you're trying to figure out product market fit, GitHub came out in, GitHub started 2007, 2008. This was a time of just like, rapid growth of developers, right? This was sort of the beginning of the software's eating the world kind of, notion, right? Open source was really beginning to take off. Open source had been around, but the extent to which it was used, a lot of businesses, we forget this now, a lot of businesses were skeptical about open source. They thought it would have bugs, which it does, but that was, there were security, there were all sorts of things, right? And so, at that time, there was beginning to be the growth. You were also seeing the growth of things like Ruby on Rails at that time. A lot of these like newer open source web frameworks that were replacing, let's say, like enterprise Java. So the mindset was really pretty good for GitHub. The other thing, of course, at the time is people were starting to understand or think about collaboration in code development, right? A fun question to kind of ask, someone asked someone today's like a developer, is like, how did people collaborate on code before GitHub? And many people wouldn't, like, it's like asking, how did you get the news before the newspaper? Like, you don't really, people used to send patches by email. People don't really think about that.
Oh, wow.
So the timing was really good. So GitHub, early days, I was a user and a friend of the company. I wasn't an employee then, but it really instantly took off. Like if you went around 2008 in San Francisco at that time, it's a much smaller tech community. Also, it's interesting. Like you'd go to a meetup, and everyone was like, "Oh, are you using GitHub? Are you using GitHub?" And so it just had this kind of like very natural growth. And like I said, the product just served this immediate need and took off. When I joined, the product had established itself really strongly on open source. Most of the open source repos were moving to GitHub.
Where were they before?
It's interesting, a mix. A lot were just self-hosted. A good example is like Django. So Django, which is a web framework I've used for a long time, used to be on SVN, which is Subversion, for if anyone that still remembers what that was. And they just ran a self-hosted Subversion server, right? And in fact, there was a question, I think they eventually moved to GitHub in, I don't remember the year, maybe 2011. But there were doubts like, what happens if GitHub goes down? What happens, GitHub's a private company. So a lot of people were just either running their own servers, or their own Git servers, or other things like that. So it wasn't like they were switching from one cloud code provider, or just mostly from some self-run stuff. And that was the early stage. And then, so when I joined, we had established enough of a kind of niche, certainly in open source among startups, and now we were beginning to move into larger companies. And a lot of that, time, and again, many of the things we take for granted about code collaboration, like that it's useful, the pull request notion, you can't, now it's established, right? But then we would still go into businesses and saying like, hey, this is a useful workflow. We were still educating people on, basic notions of like a distributed version control system. Again, something everyone just assumes, but there was an era where it wasn't like Git, right? You had a trunk-based development of the Subversion kind, right, or CVS, or even older. So getting people to understand that was actually, there was an educational component as well.
That is one of the things that we touched on when we were talking about earlier, and it's a challenge probably Greptel and many other companies have, is getting people to change workflows. So
yeah.
We're kind of here in this time, there's this new tool, there's some buzz about it, and looking back now, we can say that it definitely made people's lives easier. Do you have any stories of perhaps pushback or any skills that you learned in particular from, taking education to actually behavior change?
Yeah, workflow, so, I've been around developer tools like, most of my career. Changing workflows even to is probably the hardest part of any developer tool. People are developers specifically are very stuck in their ways. They were used to them. And even if you have a better workflow, people may not want to change it, right? So I think, when it came to like GitHub, there was certainly an educational component of like, here's a different way of developing. I think you had to show the benefits and developer the velocity of shipping, which were pretty obvious. But I think once most of it was actually educating leadership. Developers loved it immediately. Right?
Interesting.
And this
people didn't just buy stuff because developers liked it? Because that's what I hear now from engineering leadership.
I mean, I think GitHub was part of a wave of developer tools where that kind of notion had became, emerged, right?
Yeah.
Like, if you're starting a company now, everyone says, get developer love, and but no, I think for a long time it was much more top down. Now it's developers, and this is again kind of, if you want to think about it in a bigger picture, the growth of the developer. This is the thesis that again GitHub rode this kind of like just secular trend of developers becoming more influential in organizations. So now, if Twilio had that billboard for years on the 101 of, ask your developer was literally all it was, right?
It's a classic.
Now it's some like generic AI thing, I don't know, but for a while it was ask your developer. And that was because the developer was becoming and became, and still today, like a very, very influential part of
I think Stripe is like being the same thing. I actually didn't realize that because I assumed GitHub was older than that until I looked it up for this episode. And like, because Stripe was also like 2008, 2009. Yeah. And the same thing of like, well, developers becoming the center of how businesses are made. It's unclear that financial transaction software should be developer tools.
I mean, if you look at it, like many companies, even still today, there are some certainly like enterprise companies that would see developers as like cost center and not a profit center, right? This is just like, we need to build some tools or whatever. Yeah, and so I think around this time, people started to see, again, this is the software eating the world thesis, but that like every company is a software company. It's another thing we used to say all the time, right? Like we had big customers. One of my favorite customers we had was it's a generic. I'll just get the name. They made farm tractors, right? So one of those,
I can name one of those.
Yeah, so it's probably the one you think there aren't that many of them. And you wouldn't think of them as a software company, right?
Yeah.
Like, but of course they have software, right? Not only do they have the software that presumably is like embedded systems that tell the tractor how to move around. I don't know that stuff, but they have GPS stuff or more sophisticated stuff like analyzing where your crops are growing. I'm not a farmer, so I don't know, but presumably there's some kind of stuff. And they started to look at software as a competitive advantage for a business that's you wouldn't think of as traditionally a software company, right? And so those kinds of, I used to love those customers. We had a lot of those customers. And you had more sort of, I would say, forward-thinking tech leaders at those sorts of companies who were starting to realize, okay, developers matter, software matters, this is this thing that's going to give us a competitive advantage. This seems pretty obvious now, but it wasn't so obvious before. And again, we fit in right perfectly to that story. And once your developers were asking for it, you had people. We hear about this term digital transformation or whatever. It's an enterprise-y kind of term, but it's a real thing. And the more ambitious tech leaders, who might, they weren't even necessarily CTOs, right? They may be CIOs or that kind of thing. We're looking at, okay, what do our developers use? And well, it was GitHub, right? And so that's where a lot of that get developer love comes from, I think.
So is it fair to say that these people didn't have existing work? So for example, the tractor company, were they doing pull requests and stuff like that before?
No, almost certainly not.
Right.
Or
not pull requests, but did they have a Git server?
They probably had some, a bunch of, oftentimes it was so here's another thing. If you think about the world at that time, it would often be very team specific. There was no unified, there was like no unified system across the company. So, notoriously you'd have companies that would re-implement the same thing over and over and over again. There's an idea of sharing internal libraries, which obviously, of course, your company would have to say. But, you'd look and you'd have the same, companies would write, and not just like small stuff, people were writing web servers internally because you weren't using an open source web server, right? And you'd have literally companies with multiple in-house built web servers. Seems bizarre now, but that was very common. And then people started to do like, inner sourcing, right? Where you're sharing stuff within a large enterprise. So GitHub was perfect for that too. But yeah, I mean, it was a mishmash of different kinds of stuff. I remember when we opened I think our first international office was in Japan. And we did a survey of Japanese companies, kind of just understanding like what version control they were using. And I think something like this was maybe 2014, so not that long ago. Something like maybe more than that, 30-40% of companies were using no version control whatsoever. So we were the first version control that came in. And so yeah, I mean, again, there was this opportunity to just improve workflows. And so when developers saw that really helped it take off.
Yeah. I worked for a Fortune 50 semiconductor company once.
Yeah.
Might even be like a lower Fortune number than that. But they'd also not use GitHub. It was the strangest thing. I was a software intern there, and they would just kind of deploy code directly into their servers from Python files that were on people's computers.
And if we're collaborating at the company, I just email you the code?
Yeah.
And then you deploy it? Okay.
Yeah. I'm sure some orgs within used GitHub. I can't imagine the entire company no one used GitHub. There's like 40,000 employees, but like my org didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah. I might have identified it too specifically now. No, it's fine.
How would you present yourself in these situations, like a company that's completely new, doesn't really have an existing workflow?
Yeah.
Like kind of maybe something.
Well, it changed over time, right? So, like I mentioned, as we were kind of growing, we had this we had the developer love component, right? When we started early on, I think when we started to talk to like larger companies, we would mostly talk about the collaboration aspect of it, which everyone kind of got instantly. As we grew, and this is an interesting lesson for anyone building developer tools, naturally the things that people were interested in changed, right? So GitHub was for a long time fairly reluctant to build certain kinds of like enterprise features. We had a very interesting problem, which eventually I think we figured out, which is, we had two very, very different kinds of use cases, right? We have the open source use case, which has a certain, where you have maintainers and a certain kind of workflow, and you've got the enterprise or even just generally corporate workflow, which is a little different, right? Early on, we used to try to advocate developing, in an open source manner within your company, which can work. In practice, though, of course, it's much more complicated, right? You have much more set. You have rules, right? This team can commit to this thing, all these kinds of fairly complicated, fairly
like access management sort of things.
Yeah, all kinds of fairly boring things to develop. But the enterprises really, of course, wanted, right? And so there was a little bit of tension for us from a product development standpoint of how do you sort of serve, two different kinds of audiences in that way. And it was difficult to do. To the extent that, we even essentially, there were two products. We had a GitHub Enterprise product, which was an on-prem product, and then the GitHub.com product, and eventually those kind of SKUs kind of merged, and it's a little different now. But so yeah, I think when we're selling to the larger companies, we started to talk about, again, more of those kinds of like enterprise themes of digital transformation, those kinds of things that appealed more to leaders. I think those things are legit. Obviously, the terminology is kind of a meh, but it made sense. It was an enterprise version of how I think we thought about those kinds of things.
That's fascinating. I want to talk about the company and like how it was moving. So in the years that you were there, we were talking about this like concern before we started recording, but you said that for the longest time GitHub was a flat organizational structure.
Yeah, yes.
And so what did that look like? Because at the time that you joined, it was already like 50 plus people worked there, right? That's
right. Yeah, total in the company, mostly engineers. Yeah, it was tricky. So, again, GitHub comes out of like open source roots, right? Where if you think about an open source project,
sort of flat hierarchy.
Yeah, flat, and everyone can contribute. In theory, and I think there's a few interesting things about this from a. I'll just focus on sort of the product aspect of it. So, if you think about an open source project. And you think about, well, actually, let me step back one piece. Most open source projects, even the most successful ones, don't have that many contributors, actually. Fewer than you think. If you look at even the biggest projects, it's usually a small core group, maybe the core team, and then a few assorted, contributors who have some small patch that they want to get in. But generally, it's pretty small.
Yeah, it's big power law in the contributions graph, or like the top 30 contributors in the large projects are contributing like 99% of the code. There might be like 800 contributors.
Right. That's exactly
all
right.
of them.
That's exactly right. Or you have a project like, I mean, like the one I know very well going back is like Redis, for example. For a long time it was Salvatore and one other person. They were doing 95% of the commits. I mean, it's different now, but you know, and those sorts of projects, there's a lot of like mutual understanding among the contributors. Even then, it's still hard for them to collaborate. And so the direction of an open source project, it's a relatively small group that can set it. We were able to scale this sort of model of literally anyone contributing and doing it kind of without even an explicit you know, task assignment or whatever, probably longer than actually you would think, actually. And, you know, we scaled that up. I think eventually we started to run into the problem of how do you, and these are organizational problems, how do you get 50, 60 people, or eventually more, you know, to focus on a relatively small set of goals or self-organize their work? It's very, very difficult at scale. It's impossible, basically. But we tried it as long as I think we could. But eventually, I think we ran into a point where the product development, we couldn't, it was just too difficult, too scattered, right? It works, you know, at a smaller level. It didn't work eventually. And so eventually we had to develop, you know, we developed an engineering management system, and that took time. It took time to kind of learn how to do it. And I think, you know, a lot of the time that I spent as an engineering leader, which, you know, I think we could talk about organizational change forever in general, was sort of showing the value of these things and doing it in a way that for a culture that didn't really want it, right? So you had to demonstrate the value of it. If you start a company now and you just have managers from the beginning, no one thinks it could be different, right? But if you have a culture that doesn't have it,
it's fascinating.
You have to kind of figure it out. And so we did it. It took time, and it took a lot of like gradual evolution. When I started as a VP of Eng, I had all the engineers directly reported to me, so it was like 100 plus 120 directs, which obviously is not really sustainable. Eventually, we developed directors and managers, but you know, it takes time to do that when you're still building a company, right? And not just building a company, but scaling pretty rapidly, right? Yeah. You know, you would really, you'd want to almost stop everything for 6 months, just focus on that, but you couldn't do that, right? We're in the middle of rapidly scaling infrastructure, everything, right? Building a sales org. And so while we're trying to do major cultural, organizational change at the same time of rapid product iterations, it's very difficult. So
just to give an idea of scale, what was the like number of, how many users were on GitHub like at the start of your tenure versus the end?
It was I mean, we were in the millions of daily actives, I think.
That was at the start?
No, 2014.
Okay.
I don't know when 2014.
And is it like daily active is like they're committing or making a pull request or something?
We defined it as just like being either on the website, probably, I think at that time.
Okay.
I think that's right. And then I think, you know, by the time I left, it was probably 10 million daily active, something like that.
Okay, wow. So it was like several X increase.
I think that's right.
Okay.
Yeah, I may be misremembering that, but it was, it grew a lot. I mean, now it's you know, it's even larger.
Yeah.
I think, you know, the infrastructure, just to change gears slightly, the infrastructure scaling challenges that we had were actually less purely about like users and more actually about like the number of repos, the number of, I mean, obviously it's related to users, but repos, number of pushes, those kinds of things. So we could talk all about kind of what broke and how it broke. But those are some of the, I guess, a little bit of the scale at that time.
That's interesting. That's a very big difference in size. What was the hardest part about going from like 1 million developers to 10 million developers?
Yeah. Well, so I mentioned we kind of ran very lean infrastructure, right?
What did that look like in practice?
So we ran, I mean, it's amazing to me this didn't break more, which I think most people could
say that every day.
Yeah, I mean, it's really quite remarkable that it worked. We would just run, we had what were called file servers, and this is literally just, so for context, we ran a very like Unix-oriented shop, right? Like we used Unix tools, we used Unix processes, Unix IPC, like it was very Unix oriented. And so, we would just literally store Git repos on disk. We had these file servers. We ran, I mean, you got to give us a little bit of, we knew better, but we were working really quickly. We ran file server pairs. So you'd have literally a file server and another file server. They were connected over a cable, and they were syncing like a write. I'm simplifying a bit, but a write on one didn't. Still funny to think back. Wasn't considered a success unless it wrote on the other one, right? So we had the primary and a standby. And if the primary, and these would literally have just thousands of repos, like user repos, right? If one of these machines, went down, maybe because it was overloaded or whatever, we would the other machine was watching it. And would do what's called do you guys know what stoneth is? Have you ever heard that term? No one uses it anymore.
Never heard
Stoneth is a practice at that time. It literally stands for shoot the other node in the head, which was a common kind of a common kind of pattern at that time for like replication. Jeez. Where the other machine would detect that the other machine was down. It would, in order to try and ensure consistency, or it would stoneth the other machine, literally turn it off, right? And then the other machine by DNS would take over, right? And because they had an exact copy of the data, that was fine, right? There'd be some lag before the other machine came up, in which case the repos on that machine were not accessible because it had to come up.
How long would that take?
A couple of minutes, maybe.
Okay, well, that's a long time.
Yeah, and it would only affect them because we had some number of these, say we had 30 of them. If one of those went down, 1/30th of the repos were inaccessible during that period of time.
Okay.
Right, so this is
1/30th of the repos on GitHub.
Yeah, so this is atrocious, right? Like this is not good. But this is how we did it. To re-architect that took a long time, and eventually we had this thing that was called dgit, distributed git. It's a much more normal distributed thing where things were written to multiple places, and you weren't, it was different. But that was our biggest scaling issue by far, because we were rapidly growing. We had to, if we wanted to put more repos on, we had to add these nodes. But again, you can see how difficult it would be to migrate to a new system, because again, like I said, we're constantly just keeping up with what's happening in terms of the growth of the application. So to be able to do that took a while. We had to first get into our own data center roughly. Then we had to write the software. It took years. But I think it still continues to run today.
What are you most proud of now, looking back from your time as VP of Engineering?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, look, I think that we had to get, while we were transitioning the company into something that could scale both organizationally and technologically, I think there was a real risk in sort of like product development basically stopping, right? If we didn't make some of these important changes. And then I think there was definitely a period where the other real risk was, if you had serious downtime, there would be an opportunity. I mean, we were pretty well established, but if you couldn't use us as a utility, there was a serious risk of people would just leave, right? So I think keeping the application uptime pretty well. I mean, I spent so much of my time was on infrastructure. So keeping that in the hyper-scaling period, I think, was extremely good. And then being able to transition the company to a place where, organizationally we could scale and go from there. So those are really, I think, important. A lot of the work is not, it's not super exciting, right? Like, I mean, it's not like, it's not a big product launch, it's not this, but I think when a company like that is in that transitional period, those are sort of the difficult. They're not the sort of romanticized, sort of like even it's a lot of just grunt work, right? And I think for myself personally, but more the company, everyone, all the engineers who were able to work hard to make those changes happen. all the early managers who went into a situation where there was not a lot of appeal to be a manager, right? We had a whole set of initial managers who, had to kind of take a leap of faith, right?
Yeah.
To do it. And, to this day, like, I'm very thankful for all those people who were willing to step up and be a manager. We had an interesting culture. Remember, people joined the company because they didn't want managers, right? Including, not only did they not want to have them, they didn't want to be them, right? So we had a lot of people who would join the company with the desire to be an IC for their whole life, right? That was what they wanted, which is very desirable, by the way. Speaking as someone who's been a manager for a while, it's nice to be an IC. You can just write code. So for people who had joined a company wanting to be ICs, to then be like, all right, I'll be a frontline manager. That was a big commitment, and it really helped the company at that time.
I wonder if people that don't want to be managers make better managers.
I think, well, yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I certainly did not want. I like writing code. I still.
Yeah.
I think that this sounds like a little simplified, but I do think that the person who does not necessarily want to be a manager, but sees being a manager as the opportunity to make the bigger impact, or they see the need for it, is probably your best manager. First, if you're going to have, I think, more empathy for line engineers, right?
Yeah.
I think you're also recognizing the value of it, and so I do think that's true. I think there's a little bit of reluctance to be a manager is probably a good sign.
Yeah.
I think if you're too enthusiastic about it, sometimes it can be negative signal. Not necessarily.
Yeah. Day one as an IC, if you're like counting down the days and you don't have to write code anymore.
Yeah, I don't think that's great. I do think I think certainly played many mistakes here. I think one mistake that we made, and this is a good lesson, is I do think that we moved the managers. We're actually too distant from code. I think. I think we were at least our first wave of managers. We were very focused on, again, because we were trying to establish the idea of managers. A lot of the managers were trying to doing pure management, weren't writing code anymore. I don't think that's necessarily right. I don't know what the right split is, if it's 75-25, one way or the other. But I do think your managers do need to be there. I think the managers generally need to be, I think, technically respected by the reports. They don't need to be the best. They probably shouldn't be the best programmer, but I think they need to be technically respected. I also think another thing that I would emphasize, there's there's huge differences in the particular what you're managing and the kind of the level of technical ability. So let's say you're managing, I don't know, a network engineering team, right? You probably should know a little bit about network engineering. So, these are, I think sometimes in the abstract, certainly if you're like a CTO, high level, you tend to think of, unfortunately, people will often think of managers as almost interchangeable. That's certainly not the case, right? And I think, the question of what makes a good manager, there's, a lot's been written on it, but I do think that's an interesting signal, yeah.
I can't imagine a network engineer would want to report to someone that does not understand networks.
No, you wouldn't. Yeah. But you'd be surprised at how many network engineers do report to people who don't really,
they're like applying to other jobs on the side.
Yeah.
That's hilarious. That's crazy. What was something that went wrong during GitHub's scaling period?
Yeah, I think so. You can look at some of the sort of like interesting challenges that come from, I think, like I mentioned about sort of like product development. So I think one thing that we had, and it's a GitHub's actually going through now a whole other cycle of this with sort of how they're figuring out how to do AI, right? Is we had an obviously extremely popular product, right? And a question emerges when you have that level of success, instant product market fit, right? Is there can be a kind of almost paralysis where there are so many things you can do. Mm-hmm. You have so many users. There's almost there's dozens of things that any of them could probably work. And it can be hard to actually pick those because you have one that's currently working, right? So obviously this is a little bit of innovator's dilemma, right, in miniature. And so I think for us, while we were scaling, I think we never, at least at that time, we didn't fully pick one. And so I think, eventually I think the company got better at figuring out certain directions. I think obviously the AI stuff now is a pretty strong change. But we had to kind of navigate that. And I think, again, I mentioned part of that is when you have a product that people really love, you don't want to break it, right? And in the end it worked, but I think that was a particular kind of challenge, I think. And of course, like any company that scales, the hiring pace, maybe we had hired too fast at one point, we hired too slow at different points. These are things that are very hard. But I think those are probably some of the sort of obvious things that stand out.
What does hiring too slow look like? What are sort of pains that you experienced being understaffed?
That's a good question. Hiring too slow, because everyone knows hiring too fast.
Yeah, we've seen that, and it's obviously too many people is not enough to do, and company basically burns too much money.
Yeah.
Curious what the other side is like.
And so that's the one that's like the notorious problem. Hiring too slow, which I guess if I had to pick one, I'd rather probably hire too slow than too fast. But I think when you hire too slow, you find that there's you find that there's products that you want to build and you don't have the technical competency to do it. Is what I think we found, right? So it's not necessarily that you can't necessarily build. It's not that you don't have enough people per se. It's not a number thing, but you may not have the right composition to build certain things you want to do. So I don't know if that's too slow or the right. It's a mixed thing, but that's where you kind of run into, right? And then now you're fumbling to kind of reorient a company, right? So if you can kind of look a little kind of future out and be like, okay, well, we know we want to do, like, say I'm a company right now and I know I want to do AI, right? I'd be hiring AI people now, even if we haven't done it in 6 months. We're not going to do it for 6 months, right? So that's a component of it. I think the other component of hiring too slow, and it's a little complicated, but sometimes if you hire too slow, you feel these pain points, and then you end up hiring too fast, which causes its own problems, right? So,
gut reaction.
Yeah, so you kind of overreact, right? Where it's like, oh, we've got, someone sees a roadmap, and it's like, well, we have 50 items, we need to hire 100 engineers, and then that's not going to go well, right? So there is some, I don't know what it is, there is some not ideal, but near ideal, route of this. There's no easy way to do it, but you have to kind of cross the river, feeling for the stones kind of thing.
I want to selfishly ask you some questions that are just interesting to me. So, I just started working at GrepTil and I like it a lot. What are some skills that you've, over obviously your wide experience, determined are particularly important for developers at early career companies, at companies that are going through hypergrowth?
Yeah.
What are some skills that you'd suggest cultivating? Yeah.
So I actually don't think programming ability, and this is certainly going to become even more true now. I actually think raw programming ability is overrated, especially now where with AI, coding tools, it's getting easier. Now there are certain exceptions to this, right? Like if you're working on very low level systems, you're working on in operating systems maybe, but the vast majority of the code that's written for user facing web applications is relatively straightforward, right? You're building CRUD apps, right? If you're having to write, for most, this is not 100% of the cases. If you're writing really difficult code and you're stuck, that's probably a sign that there's something else that's wrong for most applications, right? Not talking about building a distributed Git system, that's going to be hard. But if you're working on a web app and it's an enterprise SaaS app and you're struggling to figure out to write the code, there's something wrong. And the thing is that you're using a framework that's not that hard. So obviously you want to be a good programmer, but I think there's diminishing returns above a certain level.
Yeah.
I think the real skill is, I would call it the meta, and when I say meta programming, I don't mean meta programming in the technical sense, I mean in this sense I'll describe, which is, and this to me is what distinguishes good engineers from great engineers and the great engineers from the very best engineers. Some people would call this taste. I guess taste is one way of looking at it, but it's actually think a little more. Taste is it tastes a little subjective, so I wouldn't call this taste. But your ability to look at programming problems, decide what's important and what's not, to know what corners can be cut and which cannot, to know, and this to know intuitively. I'll make this very concrete. One thing I've seen many really great programmers kind of get shipwrecked on this particular thing is, you become very obsessed with like perfect abstractions, right? And the reality is there is no such thing as a perfect abstraction, right? Because for a few reasons. One is business needs change, and that's unpredictable. Two, it's code, so things are going to break anyway. So I think the ability to turn off some of that, that in your brain is big, and so that's important. This is kind of the meta level, right? Yeah, sure. Another meta level is being able to look at a set of problems, like business problems, and being able to find and know the highest, most important one, right? Engineers that can do that immediately, and it doesn't, again, you may not be the greatest programmer, but if you can do that meta thing, you're immediately, very valuable, right? That skill's much harder. I have some ideas of how you can kind of cultivate that and develop that sort of agency. Another thing I tell people is just this is a career advice, but it's also, I think, true, is you have to stand out. And this is true at any company, whether it's a FANG or a startup. And you can generally stand out by taking on difficult projects, high-risk projects, right? So, and risk a few different ways. Risk is product risk, it's also infrastructure risk. But those are projects people shy away from. I can tell you just, an example. We had a very difficult problem at GitHub. We had a user management GitHub's user management system was this is just a fun, quick aside. GitHub's started, we didn't have organizations. There was no concept we didn't have an organization table. We had a user table. And when we grew and we wanted to, and in fact, GitHub, this is to show you how popular the product was, GitHub was able to scale for a while without any actual teams. People would have a personal account. People don't remember this now. You'd have a personal account under your name, or you'd make up an organization name. I'd create Acme Corp. Yeah, so have orgs. Yeah, there was no org, so you'd have a user. You'd have grep. You have a user greptile, and you'd create your repo greptile / whatever app, and you would just invite your coworkers to collaborate. Yeah. But there was no team. It was it was a private individual repo.
So this is when you start. So there's already
there were orgs at this point.
Okay,
but this is earlier.
But they were serving hundreds of thousands of developers.
Sure, at that point, and people were paying at that point. Yeah. People would pay. Again, to show you how this is what product. If you ever wonder what product market fit feels like, it's like this. Yeah. People would pay. Individuals would pay out of their own credit card. Yeah. Because there was no business. There was no business paying, and then they would get refund. They'd get reimbursed by their company. Yeah. So people would have literally I'd have TNM / my company app, whatever, and I would invite my 5 coworkers. I'd pay $10 a month or $20 a month. And then I'd get reimbursed, right? Yeah. And I would do that, right? So, again, if you're wondering what product market fit feels like, it's when individuals will pay with their own credit card. Yeah. And do it. That's product market fit, right? But I'm sorry. Going back, where were we? That was
we were talking about good developers. I really want to pick on that, maybe just one more time, because I think. So, what you said is so interesting, because I think typically most of the developers that we all think of, very obsessive people, really high attention to detail.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And it's interesting what you're saying, because from my basically short time here, it seems like velocity is being high velocity, being able to just take on big things and big unstructured things and kind of just deliver a result. Seems like that's kind of the highest value thing. Does that fit in here somehow with?
Oh yeah.
Just being high velocity and just.
Yeah. So that goes back to actually before I went off on this fun tangent. We had the organization system. we subclassed the user model.
Yeah, I remember. No, okay.
And the organization table at GitHub was a user model minus a password. So an organization at GitHub was a user, but had no password.
Okay.
But anyway, so this created very difficult problems with permissions and so on, you can imagine. So this was a very difficult project. Remember, at this time, we had what we called open allocation. I remember this is a flat organizational structure, so people could just pick whatever project they wanted to work on. No one wanted to work on this because it was not particularly... Users wouldn't see the difference, right? It was a dangerous refactor. You could break permissions, right? So, but the people who took that on, when it worked, and it did, their reputation in the company, goes up, right?
It's fantastic, yeah.
So I think taking on those things, having that high agency. Again, like in startup, one of the great things of working in a startup is almost every founder, I think hopefully most good founders are excited by initiative on the part of engineers, right? Like I think most founders, if certainly like in case now, but in general, if an engineer says, "Hey, I have this really good idea. What if we tried this? Can I spike it out?" Unless you're, I don't know, probably not going to be a successful founder, you're going to be excited by that, right? Yeah. Those are the kind of things that I think are distinguishing. So if I'm grouping these, it's like high agency, ability to discern business problems, and the ability to kind of turn off something in your head when you know something is maybe suboptimal.
I see. Yeah.
And being able to say this is fine. I think there's a saying I used to say, like, we know none of the options are perfect, but like let's ship some code, right? And I think that kind of stuff. It's
having like a Pareto razor in your head.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, and that takes time. I mean, like, and again, like this is separate from raw programming ability, right? Like, there's very little correlation between these things.
See, better than taste, like judgment is almost the better word here.
I think so. Yeah, I think taste gets almost overused sometimes.
Taste? I don't know what taste.
I don't know. It's obviously it's like a kind of I know it when I see it kind of thing. But I'm very skeptical.
It seems like attention to detail.
It started to become, I think, a term that software people, so startup founders use as like, what I'm looking for isn't just great engineers. I'm looking for engineers with taste. Yeah. And it almost doesn't mean anything at all. It just means I'm looking for really good people, and they're different from what other people are looking for.
Yeah, I get when people say it, and people like to talk about it. I'm a little. It's one of those terms that can be used and misused very easily. Where, analogous to like, I don't know, like culture fit is another kind of term where it can suit whatever
whatever you
the
want
founder wants it to be.
Yeah, it's like a polite way of saying I like hanging out with you, but like
it
would be weird to say, oh, you didn't get hired because they didn't like hanging out with you.
I'll give you like a point about taste where I think people will disagree. Functional programming. Some people really like functional programming, right? I actually I like functional programming as an intellectual, maybe some aesthetic thing. I don't really write functional programming. But there are people who would say, okay, if you have good taste, you appreciate the elegance of Haskell or whatever, right? So,
Lisp.
I mean, I actually do.
I
wouldn't run a startup with. I mean, some have, but there are people who would say, "Well, that's but that like if that's one person's taste, right?" So I think it's hard to say. I know some people would say that some taste is objective. I don't know. What I do know is that agency is a real objective thing. The ability to discern problems is real. That's a lot easier for me to talk about than taste, I guess. And that's why I kind of So I guess judgment is part of that. But this is it's hard. One of the hard things I would come back to is, and this is a favorite sort of classic engineering thing is. You say like, okay, you'll come back and say, well, what's the business impact of something like this, right? I'll give you an example of like someone wants to do a large refactor of a code base. This is sort of a classic problem, right?
Yeah.
Okay, right. And all code gets refactored, right? And then, except Haskell code never gets refactored because it's perfect, right?
Yep.
Yeah, right. So, but yeah, I think the ability to sort of like know and this is very hard, to know when a refactor is correct, to know what kind of refactor is correct, to know when it's it's a hard judgment call, right?
And it also seems to know when to stop refactoring, right?
Yeah, and to know when. I think if you're 6 months into a refactor and you're still obsessing over whether it's perfect or not, you've gone too far, right?
6 months is the bar?
Well, no, I suppose it kind of depends.
Well, it depends on the
At
context.
Stripe, when I joined the user building team there, I think there were 2 years into a refactor.
Sure.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean,
And we spent like,
at
what,
scale.
a week, 2 weeks on it?
Because what Stripe and GitHub are perhaps too load-bearing within a company for it to be like a lightweight thing to refactor it.
Yeah. But so yeah, I think that's part of that judgment. It's very hard to get that right. So
That's fascinating. Yeah. Well, let's talk about your new company.
Yeah, of
Case.
course.
So you're how long have you been working on it? What does it do?
Yeah, so we started the company a few years ago. We've gone through, speaking of product market fit, we've gone through sort of different iterations of trying to figure out what we find most interesting. The core thing for me when we started the company is, so obviously coming from GitHub, we were focused on writing code. But I personally spent a lot of time working on systems, infrastructure, keeping things running. And I've always felt like this market, you can call it, DevOps or cloud engineering or production engineering or platform engineering, has kind of been a little underserved by really high quality, good UX, right? This has been a notorious problem for a long time. If you look at the tools that have often been built for, I'll use the term ops people, which is, the traditional term. Most of these tools have been, ugly,
Like Jenkins.
Yeah, I mean,
Because PMs get to use linear.
yeah, right. While the everyone else gets really cool, like Linear is a beautiful tool, right? So Linear is a huge inspiration for, I assume, for most people now. Where the thoughtfulness of that. And it's a product that also took a long time to build as well for some of these reasons. But so I've always thought that people who work in production could use better tools, right? Another thing that I've always felt, and this is just kind of my empathy for being on call and all that kind of stuff, is a lot of the problems that people who work on call, work in production have, are oftentimes not visible even to leadership in companies, right? And some of the reasons for this are interesting. I think, so for example, I still talk to CTOs, and you'll ask, tell me about, your operations. Like, oh, everything's perfect. We use infrastructure as code, and and the app never goes down or whatever. And it's like that's not the case, right? People are fixing things all the time. Something is breaking all the time. It's in any complicated system, right? People are getting paged all the time. At a certain level of abstraction, you don't see it, which is a problem, I think. And so I've always wanted to kind of make these problems more visible. So in addition to building better tools, so that kind of started the idea of Cased, which was, okay, how do we give, tooling for? And so, we started building some stuff. Obviously, we've been excited by what's been happening with LLMs in general. And what we thought about is, okay, well, between better developer experience, better literally UX, and maybe now a little bit of LLMs, how can we look at the day-to-day work of these production engineers and make that better? And so we sort of, from looking at what people actually do, we looked at, okay, well, the things that what do people do? Well, you have to deal with deploys, right? You have to deal with what we call anomalies, which might be incidents, they might be bugs, they might be the kind of things you might get paged for. Yep. You have to look through, you have to figure out logs, right? Like, you hit a bug, you're going to try to debug logs. Mm-hmm. A lot of this work is manual, a lot of this work is difficult, takes time. And so what we've built with Cased is a few things. One is the ability to apply deployment best practices. So we have things like branch deploys, which are the ability to deploy branches into production, so you can test things out and see how they go. Insights into your anomalies that happen after a deploy, so you can know, okay, well, this deploy broke such and such, and how do I know what those are? So more than just seeing errors, but actually figuring out the actual anomaly and the cause, and then giving people insights into the logs that happen when they're actually in production. So the idea is that if you're a production engineer, to have really nice tools around that. So we're excited about it. We're still working with design partners. We're trying to figure it out. But I think where I'm most excited again is sort of like humanistic aspect. Ironic. because we're using a fair bit of AI. But again, I think that this is such an underserved market of development, right? And it's to give these people who are on call these tools, I think would be awesome. This sort of a story I always give. I was talking about why some of these things are not visible. Is when you finish an on-call shift, first thing you like to do is like maybe go to sleep, especially if it was busy, right?
Sure.
And then someone will ask, like I would ask, actually I have this problem all the time as a manager. I'd say like, hey, how are things, like how was your last shift? And a lot of people who are on call, this is true in on-call, anyone who's on call for anything, you almost don't even want to think about it. You're like, I'm done, I don't know, it was fine. Like, I don't know. And so you actually have difficulty as a leader getting visibility into actually how often unhappy people on call are. They often don't even want to deal with it, right? And that's, if you can bring that out by showing, hey, the product team deployed this and this on-call engineer was paged 20 times. This is a problem, right? Being able to get that has a sort of like a humanistic aspect to it of surfacing these things. So I think that building tools for people who are doing that, I think is useful. I also think for teams, like at your scale startups, being able to help you do, broadly it's DevOps better, while still focusing on your product is useful. It helps you scale. Again, we're talking about an era where maybe headcount is going to be lower, right, for LLM reasons or for whatever, because we're in a new era. If you can do more with a smaller team, I think there's some value there.
What do you find that your customers are most excited about?
Yeah, I mean, I think people don't. So I think a few things. So I think that everyone wants to get back to building product, right? Yeah. And even folks who are like quote unquote DevOps people, they want to be building their kind of product too. They want to be building automation, right? They want to be writing infrastructure as code or writing abstractions over infrastructure as code. Yeah. They want to be doing the profit center things, right? So I think for us, removing shit work, frankly, is what people are excited about, right? And then I think one thing that is a little overwhelming for most people is, and a little scary, especially as you're growing, is not having an customer has a the scariest thing is when a customer says, well, I've hit this bug, right? Or we have downtime. The ability to reduce downtime is something that just generally appeals to people. Yeah. Again, like going back to GitHub, the worst feeling I still get, like the GitHub had downtime last week. And
they did.
And there was people got to see that unicorn on the screen. Yeah. And I still, and I'm not the only anyone who worked at GitHub in the past, you still get like I have a visceral reaction to seeing that, like shut the sites down, right? When you've gone through high scale and angry customers and downtime, anything you can do to reduce downtime, it helps, right? Yeah. It's the worst feeling. I mean, like application bugs are no fun. Performance is no fun, but straight downtime is really dreadful, right? And I mean, I've written postmortems in my day. It's even when they're blameless, you might be blaming yourself, right? Yeah. It's not a good feeling. And so to be able to help minimize downtime, avoid it, there's always going to be some downtime, but if you can help people minimize it, that's a good feeling.
That's crazy. It is, they talk about like selling painkillers is like the most painful part of, it's like such a, like you were saying that, what was really fascinating about this here was that you still had that reaction of seeing the unicorn on the screen.
I still do, yeah.
At this point, it's been 8 years since you were last in GitHub.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, 100%. But that literally, and it's a Pavlovian response, right? Because it really is, right? Exactly you see it, and I mean, I still it's almost muscle memory, where I'll because I used to hop into chat. We did a lot of stuff in chat, and I'd be like, sites down. Or like people would hop into chat, or actually we used to say, So it would pop and be like unicorns, right? That was a sign.
Yeah.
Funny thing about the unicorn, actually, speaking of GitHub, is it was actually a very useful alerting mechanism, actually, because, and still to today, when the site was just down, the unicorn would pop up and you just go on Twitter. You just get a Twitter feed and the word unicorn all of a sudden starts spiking.
Yeah.
Sort of like, like an earthquake happens.
That's
And you could the first, I know about an earthquake if you're on Twitter.
Yeah.
Or whatever, X. You'll know about the earthquake often first from it. We would literally know, I think it's certainly true still today, you'd know downtime by literally just getting alerts for the word unicorn.
That's hilarious.
On Twitter. It was actually a pretty good alerting system.
That's funny. This only works if your word is sufficiently unique.
Yeah, exactly.
It's
And
down.
you're
Could be
their
anything.
size
It's
to
down.
have 10
Yeah.
million.
Exactly.
On the
Unique
brand.
and visibly interesting. And of course, we got a lot of developers, right?
Yeah, and they've been on Twitter the whole time.
Yeah, I mean,
Not doing their work.
and they're on Twitter all the time. Yeah, right, exactly. But yeah, I mean, I do think even to that point though about Twitter, like I haven't looked at the GitHub Twitter account, but it's got millions of followers for a software company. That's pretty different, right?
Like
that's and that goes back to something we talked a little bit earlier about that developer love that we used to call them super fans. We could spend a whole podcast just on that topic. It's really hard to fake that. It's impossible. People try, like with memes on social media. It's just fine.
It's hard.
But ultimately it comes from, I think, a few things. One is you really love the product so much that you want to almost be affiliated with it, right? People would wear, I mean, we had, we used to sell hoodies and shirts, right? Like that was one of our, it was our highest margin business. Probably was our highest margin. Actually, definitely was our highest margin business.
The Octocat merch.
Yeah, the Octocat merch was
S1.
a great business.
That's great.
But that's kind of wild if you think about it. GitHub stickers and so on. Again, people felt a strong kinship with the product, right? And again, that's very, very hard to. You can't just sort of like fake that, right? I think people try to cargo cult it sometimes, right? So for example, and you have a cool the reptile thing, which is cool. Yeah. But like that, the love of the Octocat was not necessarily because it was the icon; it was what it was, represented behind it, right?
Yeah. But it helps.
It helps to have something identifiable like that, right? And I think so. You can't. It's not just like you can't just apply the pieces and it happens. There's something very magical about that, and extremely difficult to do. So much so, it's hard to even think about another, certainly developer tools company in the last since GitHub that's really replicated that. I think Hugging Face, has had a little bit of that where
not quite the same,
but not
scale.
at that level. I don't think.
Yeah. It's rare.
It's
a unicorn event, hilariously.
Yeah, unicorn event.
Yeah.
For something that, if you think about it, is one of the most boring parts of source control is not a particularly exciting thing.
Yeah. These great companies, they almost make you forget how boring the thing they do is.
I think that's right. Yeah, I think great developer tools, you almost, you forget that, this is, if you had asked someone 20 years ago to pick something in developer tools that would become the most exciting thing, no one would have said source control. And no one would have thought about it as even the collaboration aspect of it. This was a mechanical kind of piece that you needed. It would not have been source control. I remember when I joined, I had friends of mine were making fun of me to go oh, you're going to work for a source control company, right?
Yeah.
And I was like, well, what?
Well, look at me now.
Yeah, well, I mean, but it's true, right? I mean, so the ability to kind of to kind of go beyond that, I think is difficult. But GitHub did it well, and again, for a lot of the reasons I think we talked about earlier.
I bet. Yeah. Well, there are 100 other things you could talk about, which means there's going to need to be a part 2 of this episode. This is incredible. It seems like a crazy time in every way, and I didn't even realize how new developer tools are as a category product, and just to be at GitHub as there's this monumental shift on developers' place in the industry. Yeah. It seems like a fascinating.
I mean, there was enormous skepticism. This is something I'll put in. We haven't talked about VC probably for good reasons, but there was actually a lot of skepticism, and it still is among some, of that developer tools were even an investable category, right?
Yeah.
And so I think, GitHub had a good exit, but I think, and obviously there are now many other developers, but there was skepticism around it. I remember even when the A happened, it was like, what, why is this kind of worth it, right? So I think, kind of proving out, I think one of the legacies, I think, of GitHub is again, proving at least to the world that, developer tools are important market, obviously.
Yeah.
Obviously, you all agree. But I think that it's easy, it's easy to forget that there was some skepticism around whether that would be true or not.
Incredible. Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you so much, Ted.
That's a pleasure.
It's been a great episode
Yeah,
of
awesome.
Who's a Good Dev.
Thanks, guys.